pleasure to be here in Edgware. My dad was brought up in Edgware, and my grandparents were in Edgware when I was a kid, before they went off to live in Netanya, so it's a pleasure. On January the 7th, 2015, people might remember that Saeed and Sherif Kouachi, two brothers, forced their way into the offices of Charlie Hebdo. They killed 12 people there, and they injured 11 others. And 6 days later, Charlie Hebdo produced the current issue with a cartoon on the front page saying, 100 lashes if you don't die laughing. One of the people murdered was Elsa Kayat. Can you see the screen all right? In the month before she died, Elsa Kayat received a pair of identical phone calls. You dirty Jews, stop working for Charlie Hebdo. If you don't, we will kill you. Concerned, this eminent Parisian psychiatrist and psychoanalyst who contributed a fortnightly column to the magazine discussed these messages with her family. We decided they were only verbal garbage, said her younger brother Frederick. We didn't think it could actually happen. On the morning of Wednesday the 7th of January, however, Elsa Kayat was the only woman singled out to be murdered in the attack in the offices of Charlie Hebdo. Quote, "It seems she was selected to be executed because she was Jewish," said her cousin, Sophie Bramley, a film producer and author. Quote, "They had a list of who they wanted to shoot, and they said they weren't killing the women, but she was the only woman who wasn't spared, and other women were explicitly spared." Exactly 3 years ago today, 4 Jews were murdered in an anti-Semitic attack which was linked to the attack on Charlie Hebdo on January the 9th, 2015 in Hyper Cache in a kosher supermarket. In an interview in the shop, Ahmadi Koulibaly, who was connected to the two brothers, stated that he targeted the Jews at the kosher grocery to defend Muslims, notably Palestinians. Koulibaly's dialogue with his hostages was recorded and transcribed by RTL. Koulibaly says his action was revenge for the Syrian government action and against the Western coalition actions in Mali, Iraq, and Afghanistan. So think about it. Who is the appropriate target for revenge for Western government actions, French, American, British, in Afghanistan and in Mali? Who is the appropriate target for Israel? The appropriate target was specifically, well, firstly, people who took the piss out of everything, satirical magazine, and secondly, specifically Jews. Yonan Cohen, age 28, and Yoav Hatab, age 21, were murdered by Koulibaly while seeking to overcome him and free the other hostages in the store. Francois Michel Sada and Philippe Braham were shot trying to resist also. And people will also remember that there was a Muslim worker in the shop who saved a whole number of people, and that heroism was recognized by the French government and the French state following the events. People might also remember that President Obama said a kind of strange thing. And it was quite a defensive thing that he said. He was defending American interest in this atrocity. He was defending why Americans should care. And what he says, it's entirely legitimate for the American people to be concerned when you've got a bunch of violent, vicious zealots who behead people or randomly shoot a bunch of folk in a deli in Paris. Now, I suspect we all kind of know what he meant. And I don't want to hold up Obama as a kind of really bad example of anything. I don't think he is. But I think it's a really interesting passage, a really interesting thing for him to say, because I think we can stand back and try to work out what he was saying and why. Why did he talk about this shooting of Jews in particular as a random incident. And it seems to me that President Obama was, in some sense, trying to make a universal issue out of this particular issue. He didn't want it to be about Israel or about Jews or about Israel and Palestine. He wanted to universalize it. And the way he felt comfortable doing that off the cuff in a press conference was by really missing out the issue of anti-Semitism. It's always an issue when we teach about anti-Semitism, when we teach about Holocaust, because the Holocaust is two things. We teach the Holocaust as a lesson about racism and what can happen, what the kind of outcome of the absolute logic of racism is. But we're often reluctant to teach the Holocaust as something specific to Jewish history and something specific about what happened to the Jews and something connected to this particular thing called anti-Semitism, and then connected to Jewish history, and then connected also later to the establishment and the thriving of the State of Israel. Some people attempted to universalize and some people attempted to particularize, but really it's both. And I think here Obama was tempted to universalize and to make it about everybody, and there was just a feeling that if he made it about anti-Semitism, then it would put people off, it would make them feel not quite right, and that feeling of what feels right and what feels wrong for democratic, liberal people in our society, I think is very interesting. People remember Nicholas Anelka. I do, I'm an Arsenal fan. I'm sure you are all as well. And I remember Nicholas Anelka as a very young player when he first came to Arsenal. He was very hot. This was at the end of his career. Do people remember what he did? There's the picture of him doing a really strange thing. And this connects with the French theme in remembering 3 years ago today, I think. What's he doing? Can you see the picture? What is he doing? He has a straight arm, like he wants to do a kind of Hitler salute. But his right arm, the sensible arm, is stopping it from going up. This arm is stopping him from doing what it kind of wants to do. Do you get the gesture? It's a really odd gesture, but I think it's a really important gesture to understand something about contemporary anti-Semitism. And the idea is that there's some kind of power, there's some kind of censorship stopping us from doing what we might want to do, stopping us from saying or doing things which might be deemed by the Jews to be anti-Semitic. It's a really weird gesture. Anelka's not a fascist, he's not a racist, but he's keying into this particular gesture and this particular culture. It comes from Dieudonné Mbala, who is a pretty mainstream French TV comedian. And Mbala does this quenelle. You can see him doing it at a press conference. And I think the gesture kind of encapsulates something really important about contemporary anti-Semitism. It's a cheeky gesture. It's not a Nazi salute. It's a kind of look, they're trying to stop us doing what we want to do. They're trying to stop us saying what we want to say. The Jews are up to something. They're censoring us. And it's done as a whole load of fun. We're fed up with the Holocaust, says Dieudonné. We don't want to hear about it anymore. In fact, let's have some fun with it. Let's take the kind of heart of Jewish power, which is this ability to accuse decent people of anti-Semitism, and let's pull the sting. And the way we pull the sting is by making it fun and funny, and by really saying this is something from the past. It's a little tiny bit like John Cleese, who said that Basil thought it was ridiculous for always going on and on about the war, and Dieudonné says you're ridiculous for always going on about the Holocaust, and he has this term called Shoah Anana. The Shoah is the Shoah, and ananas is a pineapple. So they're kind of pineapple Holocaust. And just now I googled it and I found the YouTube video of Shoah, and there's a really catchy little tune, and I'm almost humming it. And that's what Dieudonné does. Dieudonné goes beyond any kind of political anti-Semitism that we're kind of recognising at the moment in the Labour Party, and he really plays. And lots of other people play too. This is a Belgian representative in the European Parliament doing the quenelle. This is somebody dressing up their kid. Ho, ho, ho. This is somebody at the Berlin Holocaust Memorial. People do selfies. And again, you get the gesture. The gesture isn't, look at me, I'm a Nazi. The gesture is, look at all this fuss. And look at me, I'm really naughty, and isn't this fun? This is outside the Jewish school where 4 people were murdered in Toulouse. He's a bit shy, this one, isn't he? He's not really doing it properly. This is the hotel. This is Auschwitz. This is by the Memorial de la Shoah. This is a Hanukkah. So it's kind of iconic. This notion that the Jews are up to something, the Jews are trying to stop us doing what we want to do and saying what we want to say, but we're going to do it anyway. Shoah Bakery, do you get the joke? Ho, ho, ho. Anne Frank. This is Jean-Marie Le Pen. So I would say that the story of my book is a story of the mainstreaming of anti-Semitism. It's a story, in a sense, my own biography begins in the 80s when I was on, as was also already mentioned, I was in a little part of the British left in the student movement, and we were fighting the people who were trying to ban Jewish societies, trying to ban UJS on the basis that it was Zionist and therefore racist. And this was something that happened on the edges, in little kind of left, Trotskyist, Stalinist politics. And the story of my book and the story that I'm trying to bring out today is a story of the mainstreaming of that, from the edges into the centre, from the opposition into the student movement, into the unions, into the Labour Party, and perhaps into number 10 Downing Street, and onto the TV. On January the 11th, 2015, 2 days after Amédi Coulibaly had murdered 4 people at the Kosher supermarket Hypercacher in Paris, Dieudonné wrote on Facebook, "You know that tonight, as far as I'm concerned, I feel like Charlie Coulibaly." This was a parody of Je suis Charlie. He kind of wanted to say Je suis Charlie, but also Je suis Coulibaly. I'm Charlie, I'm the victim of the shooting, but I'm also Coulibaly, the victim of Islamophobia, the victim of global imperialism, who's fighting back against this global system of domination in the Hypercacher. People remember Je suis Charlie. People wanted to make solidarity with the victims of Charlie Hebdo. And Dieudonné wants to make solidarity with them, but also with their killers. As though we're all kind of victims of a third party, of a third power. 9th of December, a month ago, exactly a month ago, Benjamin Gerber wrote on his Facebook page, "Tonight my synagogue was firebombed. Thank God nobody was hurt." From Gothenburg in Sweden. This was in the aftermath of the controversy about Donald Trump and his recognition of Jerusalem as the capital and all of that stuff. Quote, "I live and work in the Gothenburg Jewish community and my children go to the Jewish school. To non-Jews it's shocking, but to us it's simply the backdrop of Jewish life in Sweden. We live our lives behind high fences, blackened windows and security doors. Sometimes it's good to get a reminder why. Still, I hope and pray to live to see a day when the doors of our synagogue can be open as the Swedish church down the street, inviting passers-by in to warm themselves from the cold and to have a moment of spiritual peace. That day may never come, but my hope will never die." Now, it seems to me that this situation requires slightly more than just a very small number of ultra-radical terrorists prepared to carry out this kind of attack. It also requires a certain kind of public sensibility about synagogues. It also requires a certain kind of attitude to policing. it also requires a certain kind of fear of making a clear stand in favour of ordinary democratic rights. It seems to me that Sweden is not that different from Britain. I'm not trying to be alarmist, I don't want to be alarmist, but the discourse in public in Sweden is quite similar to that in Britain. It's different in each country. In France, for example, in France there's a history of colonialism, like we have in Britain, but there's also the history of Vichy. There's Vichy and Algeria. So in France there's a strange kind of mixture, and Jews from Algeria and Arabs from Algeria live in the same neighbourhoods in Paris, and there's this strange combination of memory. In Germany there's no colonial guilt, but there's obviously quite a lot of Holocaust guilt, and that changes the way people think about Israel and Palestine and anti-Semitism. In South Africa, people are tempted to think about Israel and Palestine through the lens of their own history of apartheid. In Ireland, people are tempted to think about green and orange politics and pro and anti-imperialism and pro and anti-terrorism. And everybody is tempted to use the Israel-Palestine conflict in order to perform and communicate their own political identity. And this is a really interesting issue. Let me give you an example. I was at an introductory meeting for students at my college. This was a few years ago, actually. And a guy from the student union came to introduce what the student union does. And he said, we're running 3 campaigns. We're running a campaign against fascism, we're running a campaign against fees, and we're running a campaign against the occupation. And then he went on to talk about sports clubs and how you can join and drama and the rest of it. And I'm looking around the room and I'm thinking, how does everybody here know which occupation he's talking about? How did the occupation get capitalised? How did everybody in the room understand that this occupation was particularly important around the world? And it struck me at that moment that students were being socialised politically into a world where we create our identities through the Israel-Palestine conflict. And if they didn't understand why he talked about the occupation, all they had to do was ask, and they would be told. Let me give you another example. Labour Party conference this year, Palestine Solidarity campaign, very cleverly took a lot of lanyards. You know what a lanyard is? You put your credentials around your neck and it hangs around your neck. So people took the Labour Party lanyard off and they put on a Palestinian colour lanyard. And there were lots and lots and lots of people running around Labour Party conference with these Palestinian colours on them. Now, I have no problem with that formally. I have no problem. I support a Palestinian state. I support the creation of a democratic, peaceful Palestinian state, and I'm very happy for them to have a flag, and I'm very happy for people to fly their colours in solidarity. But what was going on here was something else. What was going on here was that the Corbyn supporters at Labour Party conference were performing their own identity, their own political identity, around this issue. Now I'm a bit worried. I'm going on YouTube, I'm on video, people are going to say, Hirsh, he says it's anti-Semitic to wear Palestinian colours. And this is the complexity of it. Of course, I'm not saying it's anti-Semitic to wear Palestinian colours, but what I'm saying is that this issue becomes a symbolic issue around which people create an idea of who they are and who they're not. There's a long history, of course, of people in the Christian world defining their identity in relation to Jews. So, let me move on. I have lots and lots to say. Also in December, there was a demonstration in London at which a call in Arabic for the killing of the Jews and the coming killing of the Jews was repeated and repeated and repeated all evening long. And it was organised by the Palestine Solidarity campaign, by the mainstream campaign that is financed by the unions for Palestine, mainly for a boycott of Israel, actually. Now, the people singing that weren't really PSC people, but they were there, and they created a backdrop. You can see also in the picture, you can just about see some swastikas too. That's odd, in London in December 2017. And if you look very closely, the image here, it says, "Stop swastikas." It's against swastikas, meaning it's against Israel. So there's this language that people kind of understand. And again, there's this kind of cheekiness to it. Look what we're going to do. A bit like the quenelle. We're really radical, and we're prepared now to stand up against power and censorship and Zionism and to say what needs to be said. We're getting braver. This is a truly brave woman. This picture has become iconic in the last few days from Iran, from the uprisings in Iran after, goodness me, how many, 20, 30, 40 nearly years of the Iranian Revolution. There's a big uprising. So you would expect radical and revolutionary people in Britain to support it. Would you not? This is the leader of the Labour Party, working not for the uprising against the Iranian regime, but working for the Iranian regime. This from a few years ago, before he became leader of the Labour Party. He was a paid propagandist for the Iranian state propaganda machine. You'd think that on its own would be enough to disqualify him from being leader of the Labour Party. That would be very simple, wouldn't you? But we live in times when it isn't. The other guy, by the way, is George Galloway. Corbyn was standing in for George when George was on one of his holes. So this story of mainstreaming, this story that comes from the really weird Stalinist and Islamist and Trotskyist movements, has suddenly moved right into the mainstream of British political culture. By that I don't mean to say that Britain is anti-Semitic or that it has kind of become completely normal. It's still contested, it's fought over. But there's a sensibility which says anyone who has a go at Jeremy, like I'm doing, like putting pictures up of him supporting the Iranian regime, which is an anti-Semitic regime, anyone who does that is up to something. Anyone who does, we know that Jeremy's a lovely guy. I had a meeting with a Hasidic rabbi a year or two ago, and I said, there's an issue with Jeremy Corbyn, and he said to me, but Jeremy is a mensch. When we have a problem with housing benefit, when we have a problem with whatever housing in the local authority, Jeremy's there for us in Islington, in Hackney. And I said, indeed, Jeremy's a mensch, and what we're talking about here is the anti-Semitism of the mensches, of the good people. I wanted to call my book The Anti-Semitism of the Good People, but my wife wisely wouldn't let me. She said, people won't understand. This is Dudoneh. You remember Dudoneh, the quenelle guy with President Ahmadinejad of Iran. So Dudoneh seems like a really kind of out there guy. He seems like a kind of open anti-Semite, doing singing and dancing about the Holocaust as a pineapple. But look, he's not quite so out there as we would kind of think, is he? Famously, Jeremy Corbyn referred to people in Hamas and Hezbollah as his friends. Do you remember? And he was challenged with this actually in Parliament, PMQs, and on Channel 4. And he kind of squirms out of it, and he has a kind of plausible response. He says, look, I'm for peace. I'm for peace between Hamas and between the Palestinians and Israel, and I'm for talks. And I think there should be talks. And I had these guys in a room, and I was being polite and diplomatic. I can hardly call them scumbags. I call them friends, and that's how we began a dialogue. And that sounds kind of reasonable, until you read what he said in the second half of this same speech. He's talking about Hamas and Hezbollah. He says, the idea that an organisation that is dedicated toward the good of the Palestinian people and bringing about long-term peace and social justice and political justice in the whole region, that's how he describes Hamas and Hezbollah. So forget the friends, I'm quite happy for him to be polite to people in the room, but this is about political support. If I said that I believe the KKK was dedicated to the good of the American South, you wouldn't have much difficulty in understanding what my politics were, would you? Yet this analogous statement seems really difficult for people who don't want to understand. Why am I talking about Jeremy Corbyn? What do I have against Jeremy Corbyn? Actually, Jeremy Corbyn is not the problem. Jeremy Corbyn is a kind of symptom of the problem. For 40, 50 years, Jeremy Corbyn did not come within a sniff of close to even the shadow cabinet or the Labour leadership, because people said, he's an extremist. Something has happened in the last year or two which has allowed him to come to the fore and which has prevented people who point out what's wrong with him from being heard. So if you say there's a problem with Jeremy Corbyn, you immediately bring suspicion onto yourself. Why is this guy talking so badly about Jeremy? Jeremy's nice, he's for the poor, he's for the NHS, he's for housing, he's for the left behinds, he's for all the people who weren't helped by the Labour government. Why are you being horrible to Jeremy? Jeremy Corbyn jumps to the defence of Raad Salah, a man who in Israel indulges in blood libel in order to discredit and to delegitimise Israel. I must be exaggerating, no? Let's look at the quote. Raad Salah, we have never allowed ourselves to knead the dough for the bread that breaks the fast in the holy month of Ramadan, the children's blood, he said. Whoever wants a more thorough explanation, let him ask what used to happen to some children in Europe whose blood was mixed in with the dough of the holy bread. Well, this is just criticism of Israel, isn't it? Corbyn said Salah is far from a dangerous man, and he promised that when Salah had finished being chased around by the CST through the courts, he would invite him to have tea on the terrace of the House of Commons with him. Stephen Sizer is a boycotter, an anti-Zionist, somebody who's been quite fixated with the crimes of Israel, both real and imagined, for a number of decades. He's a vicar in the Church of England. I know people who are particularly interested in him, who've been following his case and highlighting every time he said something awful. And Jeremy Corbyn was always defensive of him. Sizer is the victim of a smear by the Israel lobby, he said. If you raise the issue of anti-Semitism about somebody who's just siding with the oppressed, then you get portrayed as a lobby, something powerful, something rather behind the scenes, something rather dirty. In the end, Stephen Sizer put a thing on Facebook, headlined 9/11 Israel did it. And then the church had to move against him, and then Jeremy Corbyn had to drop his defence. Let me give you an example of something else that happened fairly recently, last couple of months. This was put on the Facebook post of one of the leaders of the Union of Jewish Students, and actually a leading guy in the Jewish Labour movement, the Jewish organisation in the Labour Party. You soft Ute, let me explain in the most something way possible to your fascist self, you Zionist fuck. The land did not belong to the Jews. It was unlawfully gifted by the British government via the fascist Balfour Declaration, which expelled all Muslims and Christians from the area to create Israel. Until now, Muslims, Christians and Jews who speak against Zionism get killed, jailed, or tortured and get labelled anti-Semitic. But in real life, Zionism is anti-Semitic. So never come against us again, or else it won't be words hitting you, it'll be my fists connecting with your head top. Peace out, dickhead. Or as I know who you are, Liron, fake Ute slave to the Jewish labour movement, also known as the Zionist lobby. Now, as a researcher, I don't know what this means. I don't know the significance of it. I don't know who wrote it. I don't know what it represents. And this happens a lot. Stuff happens, and as a researcher, you get kind of accused of mobilising a methodology of anecdote. Interestingly, Hannah Arendt talked about the rise of the totalitarian movements in Germany and in Russia, and she talked about the importance of an alliance between what she called the mob and the elite. And the thing that struck me when I saw this Facebook post, whose importance we don't really know, although actually I said this at an event in Limud a couple of weeks ago, and people said, yeah, we know who it is, and anyway, I didn't know who it was. The elite and the mob. If we think of this guy as being part of the mob, who's the elite? Alain Badiou, for example, wrote a book in 2013 called Reflections on Antisemitism, described on the publisher's website as explaining how facile accusations of anti-Semitism are used to stifle dissent. Gérard Bensoussan reviewed the book in Libération, arguing that in making anti-Semitism respectable, the extreme left had achieved what the far right could only dream of. He argues that Badiou participates in a contemporary restoration of French anti-Semitism. Badiou is respectable. He's a philosopher. He's a Maoist. That, strangely, doesn't prevent him from being respectable. He's respectable in my own department. In my own department is one of his chief translators at the University of London. Badiou's first response is that there, quote, could be no such thing as a far-left anti-Semitism, an absurd oxymoron. So Badiou is saying that it's not even possible. So it's not an empirical question. We don't look at the left, look at the world and see if there's anti-Semitism or if there isn't anti-Semitism, but we look at the words. And the words tell us that if something is left, it cannot by definition be anti-Semitic, because the left is not anti-Semitic. And if something is anti-Semitic, it cannot by definition be left, because the left is not anti-Semitic. So a kind of, apart from anything else, he's teaching a profound ignorance of our own left tradition. There have always been people on the left tempted by conspiracy theory and tempted by anti-Semitism. The left looks at the world and it says there's lots of things wrong with the world. There's these power structures which seem to give power to the rich people, the banks, the white people, the men. It looks like a conspiracy. And there have always been people tempted by actual conspiracy theory. And when you have conspiracy theory, it's always this close from anti-Semitic conspiracy theory. So Badiou teaches young people that not only was there no argument, between Bakunin and Bruno Bauer and Karl Marx and the Auguste Bebel, who talked about the socialism of fools in the 19th century. This didn't happen because anti-Semitism on the left is not possible. I'll simply give Professor Bensoussan, he said, a smack in the face if ever I come across him. This is a respectable philosophy professor from one of the big institutions in Paris, which will be richly deserved reward for his muck-spreading rhetoric. Is this familiar? Yes, this is familiar, because this is really precisely the same as whatever it was, be careful of your head top, dickhead, I'm going to punch you. So we have some anonymous guy threatening to punch Jewish activists, and we have a big respected philosopher threatening to punch his Jewish academic critics. And this threat to punch is very important because it's an exclusion from the community. Who do we talk to? Who do we discuss? Who do we have a dialogue with? Who do we present evidence to? Those are people within a community of reason. Who do we punch? Who do we accuse of speaking only in bad faith? Who do we accuse of being representatives of a foreign racist, Nazi, apartheid, Trumpist power? Not people who are part of the community with whom we debate. And this is one of the key ways in which people run into anti-Semitism. Because if they raise the issue of anti-Semitism and they say, I'm a bit worried about this or that, or mainstreaming or blood libel, they are told in no uncertain terms, not that they made a mistake, not that they're wrong, but that they're lying, that they're part of a lobby, part of a secret power trying to shut you up. Remember the quenelle, the gesture is about being silenced. And that's how it works. This is Malia Bouattia. I'm talking about the mainstreaming of these phenomena. Malia Bouattia wasn't some little person on the edge of the student movement. She won the presidency of the NUS. And she talked about mainstream Zionist-led media outlets. She talked about Birmingham University as being a, can't remember the quote now.
Zionist outpost.
The Zionist outpost, thank you. She spoke against the peace process on the basis that the peace process itself was part of strengthening the colonial project. She spoke against BDS on the basis that BDS was non-violent and that she wanted people to be ready to support violent resistance. There's another lesson actually with the story of Malia Bouattia, because often people hear what I have to say and they get worried and they think that I'm just telling them everything's awful and it's getting worse, and it kind of is. But Malia Bouattia won the presidency of NUS, and the next year she lost it. She was defeated. And she was defeated, looking around this room, by many of your children and grandchildren who fought really courageously and cleverly and intelligently and politically within the student movement and defeated her. They didn't always do it by insisting that everybody agreed with them. They did it smartly. They did it by making political alliances. They did it by taking people to Israel. And they defeated her. So this should be also a lesson to us that we are not cooked yet. We are not finished yet. In the Labour Party, in the campuses, in Britain, we can still win. Not in Unite, however. This is Len McCluskey. Famously, and he said it again in the other day in an interview for Jewish News, he said, the row over anti-Semitism within the Labour Party is nothing more than a cynical attempt to challenge Jeremy Corbyn's leadership. This is what I'm talking about. If I raise the issue of anti-Semitism in the Labour Party, McCluskey doesn't come to me and say, David, let's have a debate. Let's look at the evidence. Let's weigh it up. Let's see if you're right or you're wrong or you're a bit right or you're a bit wrong. No. He says, David, you're involved in a cynical attempt to smear the left and to discredit Jeremy Corbyn and to silence the voice of the Palestinians, and you don't belong here. These are all the stupid things Ken Livingstone said. And Moshe Machover. Here's the Livingstone formulation. Ken Livingstone, for far too long, the accusation of anti-Semitism has been used against anyone who is critical of the policies of the Israeli government, as I have been. There are two key elements to this formulation. One is that somebody is using the accusation of anti-Semitism. It's not something kind of organic, it's not an organic question. Is there anti-Semitism in the Labour Party? No, it is something which is used for an ulterior purpose. For far too long, the accusation has been used against anyone who is critical of the policies of the Israeli government. And that's the other twist in the Livingstone formulation, is that it takes everything and discusses it as though it was criticism. So we've seen Rad Salah and his blood libel. Under the Livingstone formulation, it becomes criticism. Anyone who raises the issue of anti-Semitism, is trying to close off criticism. We've seen Stephen Sizer, the vicar, with his 9/11, Israel did it. That becomes criticism. We've seen the movement to boycott, divest, make sanctions against Israel. That becomes criticism. And anyone who's against criticism is self-evidently a bad person, aren't they? Because we're all for criticism. So again, think of the quenelle, think of Nicholas Anelka, who I hope is kind of a bit of an innocent fool, like many footballers are. But the gesture, I'm being silenced by this arm, I'm having to self-censor, because I know what will happen. You know, I'll get a 5-month ban and I'll be all over the FA inquiry and the rest of it. Think of Nicholas Anelka. Here's a couple of graphical illustrations of the Livingstone formulation. Can you see the pictures? The world is having its mouth shut by this accusation of anti-Semitism. The world wants to scream about Israel's crime against the Palestinians, but the Jew is shutting the world's mouth. The other one's interesting, right? Because as you look at the picture, this is you, I think. This is you with one right hand of the Stars and Stripes and the left hand is the Israeli flag, and you're gagging, silencing the guy who's concerned about Palestinian rights. Who is the you who's doing this? Who is the you that has one American arm and one Israeli arm? And it seems to me that that's the key question. How is it that Jeremy Corbyn can believe that Hamas and Hezbollah are in some sense on the side of justice and liberation? Judith Butler. Anyone heard of Judith Butler? A very well-known, famous philosopher, said that Hezbollah was part of the global left. How is it possible? And I'll tell you how it's possible. Because what it says, what it articulates, is a worldview which says that the key evil on the planet is this global machine, which you might want to call capitalism, or you might want to call it imperialism, or you might want to call it modernity. Keep your eye on the ball. Modernity, capitalism, imperialism is the key aggressor. It hurts people, it causes wars, it causes hunger, it causes bad health care. That's the key aggressor. And anyone who's against it is in some sense on our side. So it's a worldview which is actually a much more common worldview than, if you think about it, than you might imagine. We, the radical intellectuals, we do have a problem with democracy. We do have all of us have a problem with democracy, with the kind of hypocrisy of men going to parliament and serving their own interests. We have a problem with law, because rich people have better access to law than poor people. We have a problem with human rights, because we know that human rights are often a cover for power. We have a problem with science, because we know that science is often mobilized as a powerful tool. And it's tempting to take those bits of truth, those bits of critique, and make out of them a worldview. A worldview in which democracy, science, knowledge, representation, the media are all completely lost. And Hannah Arendt, if you look at her work on the rise of totalitarianism, was very clear about that. To build a totalitarian movement, you need the ethic that nothing which exists in our society is worth defending. You need to tear it all down, take off all the hypocrisy, and build from new. And we've seen elements of that not only amongst the radical intellectuals, and not only amongst the Corbynites, and not only amongst the Islamists, but also it's moving into the mainstream of right-wing politics, amongst some of the politics of Brexit and some of the politics of the Trump presidency. These cartoons are created by a guy called Latuf. And Latuf is a Brazilian cartoonist People might remember the controversy in Denmark over the cartoons which portrayed the prophet and the threats that were made against them, the threats which were eventually carried out against Charlie Hebdo. And people might remember that the anti-Semitic regime in Iran, the Ahmadinejad regime, who Jeremy Corbyn also worked for, created a Holocaust denial cartoon competition. Do you remember that? And he invited people, he said, the West makes cartoons which blaspheme against my religion. I'm going to invite people to make cartoons which blaspheme against your religion. Your religion is the Holocaust. Back to, of course, Dieudonné and his show Ananas, that what we need to do really is to kind of lampoon and blaspheme in order to pull the sting of Jewish power. Latuf won third prize in Ahmadinejad's Tehran Holocaust denial competition. And Latuf is interesting because you see Latuf on the anti-racist, anti-Zionist left, but you also see him going off to Tehran to get plaudits from the Holocaust denier and the dictator. So he's one of the connections, as is Dieudonné actually, between the Mensches, the good people who support the Palestinians, apparently, and the open anti-Semites. I'm going to stop soon because I want to have people to have the opportunity to ask questions. This is a very nice little quote which illustrates lots of things, I think. It's from Yasmin Alibi Brown. It was from her op-ed piece in The Independent in 2015 at the time of Jeremy Corbyn's first campaign to become leader. I don't know why, but it's no longer available on the internet. It's kind of disappeared from the Independent's thing. What's the word? You know, bank of things. Archives. Thank you. Headline: fling mud if you must, but don't call Jeremy Corbyn an anti-Semite. It's a kind of threatening headline. We haven't actually tonight or ever called Jeremy Corbyn an anti-Semite. We've said that he's been involved in anti-Semitic politics. He's been to Gaza 5 or 6 times. He's been hosted by Hamas, who he believes are dedicated to the good of the Palestinian people and to peace and justice in the region. We've said all that. We've said that he's taken money, £20,000, for doing George Galloway's propaganda slot on Press TV. We haven't actually called him an anti-Semite, and if people want to ask me why, I'll answer that question later. It is an accusation that is both absurd and menacing. Well, I'm not sure it is absurd. I think I've at least given you enough evidence today to think that it's not absurd. The accusation is menacing, or the anti-Semitism is menacing. The right, Blairites, and hard Zionists. Hard Zionists. Are there any hard Zionists here, or just Zionists here? The right, Blairites, and hard Zionists have formed the most unholy of alliances to slay the reputation of the next likely leader of the Labour Party. Slay the reputation. Anybody been watching Game of Thrones? What do we slay? Most depressing of all is the collusion between the powerful right and Zionists, right? We're going back to the story earlier on that if you're a Zionist, if you are accused of the crime of Zionism, then that is a way of putting you outside of the community of reasonable discussion. Here, it's done by saying that Zionism is in collusion between the powerful right and the Zionists. They seem determined to crush all alternatives to neoliberal economics and Western hegemony. Hang on. Zionists are determined to crush all alternatives to neoliberal economics and Western hegemony. Why? Why would Zionists, people who believe in some kind of collective national self-defense and freedom for Jewish people, why would they be interested in worrying about neoliberal economics in China or in Brazil or in Europe? Why? And I think you're beginning to see the answer to that. They seem determined to crush all alternatives to neoliberal economics and Western hegemony as the forces of darkness turn on Corbyn. Who are the forces of darkness? The hard Zionists, the powerful right, the people who are against all alternatives to neoliberal economics. The forces of darkness turn on Corbyn. Incidentally, the forces of darkness is a term also used by Stephen Sizer about the chief rabbi who opposed boycott, divestment and sanction. The forces of darkness turn on Corbyn. The leadership contest continues its descent into a passion play. Goodness me, what is a passion play? What is a passion play? A passion play is a play which depicts the singling out and the murder of God at Easter time. And very often a passion play depicts the Jews as being responsible. So how is it that Yasmin Alibhai-Brown suddenly brings that into this discussion? Astonishing. So in her call, her threat, really, don't call Jeremy Corbyn an anti-Semite, she mobilises, I don't know how many, 3, 4, 5 anti-Semitic tropes in one paragraph. It's kind of beautiful. I'm going to end up by talking about one more thing. I want to say something about Jewish anti-Zionism. I think it's perfectly understandable that Jews have a particular interest in Israel. I do. I have a particular interest in Israel, and I think part of the reason for that is because I'm Jewish. Because my own family history is tied up with moving around with anti-Semitism, with some people going to Israel, some people going to other places. I can understand why Jews are particularly interested in Israel. I can also understand why Jews care passionately and particularly that they want Israel to be good. I do. I want Israel to be a good place that I'm proud of, that I feel comfortable in. Excuse me. Now, what sometimes happens is that Jews they find themselves kind of caught up in a worldview in which their own relationship to Israel becomes ever more important and more important and more important, and their own concern with Israel's crimes, both real and imagined, becomes more important. And they also get caught up in a world, in politics or in unions or in academia or in the arts, where being against Israel becomes a badge of being in the community of the good people, the Menschers. And those two things sometimes combine, and they make Jews sometimes feel that their key politics in life, their key concern in life, and sometimes their key way of being Jewish is by opposing the bad things that Israel does. Now that's one thing. You can kind of understand it. Sometimes people go a bit far. You can understand that. What happens when Jews take that Jewish obsession with Israel's crimes out of the Jewish community and into civil society more generally is a kind of slippage. So they kind of say the main enemy is at home. The main enemy for Jews is Netanyahu and the Israeli government and Lieberman and all these country cousins who do stupid things and make us all look bad. The main enemy is at home. And they go out into the wider labour movement, into the churches, into civil society, and they say the main enemy is at home. And they find people really quite keen to answer, yeah, you know, you're right. The main enemy is in Israel. And the main enemy at home used to be a Bolshevik slogan which said we should all oppose our own power first, and then we should go and make solidarity with other people who are opposing their own governments. And what happens here quite often is that Jews oppose their own leaderships, and they kind of get all caught up in a world where Likud and the Israeli state and the Jewish Chronicle and the chief rabbi and the board of deputies are all kind of becoming one big powerful thing, and we oppose it, and they take that sensibility and that culture out into the unions, into the Labour Party, into a wider culture, and there it can be quite toxic in a way that they don't understand. I can say more about that too if people are interested. So I want to say thank you very much for listening to me for so long, and I'm very happy to talk to people, to answer questions, and of course to sell you my book for £15.
Questions, and it really is a question time and not an opportunity to make a statement by yourself. Yes. Please identify yourself.
Martin Shaw. I get confused, and certain things worry me. I mean, okay, so Corbyn is against settlements. That worries me. He's no doubt against the fact sanctions, or he probably thinks that there should be no sanctions against Iran, and he probably thinks that Jerusalem is not the capital of Israel. But then Theresa May would say exactly the same thing. So that worries me as well. And I do get slightly confused, and I was going to say sympathy, but with Ken Livingstone's view, but it's not really sympathy. I don't, if you are anti the Israeli government's policies, and I'm actually not against them personally, but if you are, then does that still, it still worries me, saying that does that make you anti-Semitic? And I feel it does, but I can't quite get around that.
Okay, so the first part of the question, I think Theresa May's policy is a kind of established British government policy, comes from the Foreign Office. I don't think it's too bad, right? They say that they're for the creation of a democratic Palestinian state, and in the abstract, I'm certainly also for the creation of such a state if it was possible. Theresa May didn't say that Jerusalem's not the capital of Israel, but they said that there's this long diplomatic tradition, blah, 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 blah. And the third thing about the settlements, yeah, well, you know, many people have different positions on the settlements, and Jews can certainly disagree and argue, and other people can disagree and argue about the settlements, about whether they were right, about whether they were wise, and we can have those discussions. So the question, the important part of the question, I think, is where is the anti-Semitism? Of course, one can be critical of Israel, one can be critical of this or that thing that Israel does or that it thinks of itself as being. But to think of Israel as the key to the global campaign against neoliberal economics, to talk about people who oppose anti-Semitism as being authors of a passion play, to support Hamas and Hezbollah politically, and to say that these organisations are for peace and justice, to do what Ken Livingstone says and say that actually Israel in this day and age are the Nazis and the Palestinians are the Jews, and to teach young people to think of the overwhelming majority of Jews who consider themselves in one way or another to be connected somehow to Zionism, to teach people to think of them as Nazis and to shun them as one would shun Nazis. These have clear anti-Semitic outcomes. Hostility to Israel can be anti-Semitic in its outcomes, and that's quite easy to show. I do a lot of that in my book. It can also be anti-Semitic in its underlying motivation, which is much more difficult academically, methodologically, and also politically to get your hands on. It can be anti-Semitic in its singling out and its centrality of Israel, in the way it creates Israel as a kind of symbol of evil, and the way it creates Palestine as a kind of symbol of the oppressed universally. So there's many ways in which it can happen. And it's not a question that we can settle by having a discussion about words. It's an empirical question. It's a question that you can only answer by looking at what happens in a church or in a trade union or in a party or in a cultural milieu where these ideas become important. And then it's an empirical finding that all sorts of anti-Semitic things come with it.
Jerry Lucas, where do you see Seamus Mill's influence in Jeremy Corbyn's attitudes?
I think Seamus Milne is quite important. I mean, I don't know. One talks to people in the Labour Party and one gets gossip. I've been told that Jeremy Corbyn doesn't have a computer, he doesn't have email, he's not on Facebook, he doesn't read the papers. What he knows he gets from Seamus. That's gossip. I don't know if it's true or not, but Seamus Milne has a long and clear history of being in and around the British Communist Party, a long history of supporting various things to do with the Iranian regime and supporting Hamas and Hezbollah and acting as a public apologist for them, and also acting as a public apologist for terrorism in the sense that he says that the root cause of terrorism isn't really the terrorists, but the root cause of terrorism is the Western global imperialist capitalist machine which drives people to terrorism. Seamus Milne is a very kind of coherent political operator, and I think it's really significant that Corbyn put him at the centre of his political machine. And the other guy who's also at the centre of his political machine is Andrew Murray, who has a similar Communist Party heritage, who ran the Stop the War campaign. And the key to understanding the Stop the War campaign is in the name. It's not Stop the Wars. It's Stop the War, as though there was one war. And Stop the War thinks that there is one war, which is the war of everyone in the world against imperialism, capitalism, modernity, against America and the United States and Europe, in reality against the democratic states. So this politics, which comes out of the Soviet Union and out of the kind of rise and decay of Stalinism, is alive and well around Jeremy Corbyn. But he's not an innocent himself. He's somebody who's made himself into a figurehead in Parliament for all of these campaigns for many, many years. He knows what he's doing. He's been to Gaza, I think, 5 or 6 times, a whole number of times, and he's been hosted by Hamas. It's kind of reminiscent of the British intellectuals who went to East Germany. In fact, Corbyn, thinking about it, did go to East Germany with Diane Abbott, famously on a motorbike. And they came back from these countries and they said the Soviet Union has the most progressive constitution on the planet that's ever been written. And one wonders, did they not notice what was happening in the Soviet Union, or did they not know, or did they not care, or did they just have a, So, I mean, one of the key Jewish anti-Zionists in the University and College Union came back from Gaza gushing about how he was looked after and they weren't anti-Semitic at all, and he had a great time in Gaza being hosted by Hamas, and he stayed in a nice hotel and all of this stuff. It's kind of mind-boggling.
Hello, Deborah Gaffney. Excuse me if I haven't got my facts exactly straight, but I want to ask your opinion on the situation where I think it was Priti Patel, as development involved in international development, was recalled from Israel when it was found that she was meeting with members of the Israeli government, supposedly I got my name wrong, meeting with Israeli government ministers, was supposedly in secret. Do you believe it was secret, her meeting? And what do you think if she would have been in the same position in some other country of the world, meeting with ministers of that country in her role as in international development?
Yeah, look,
and how does that?
I don't know about the details either, but there's 2 things I want to say about that. One is that it's true that Israel has been treating a lot of people from the Syrian war I think in one particular hospital in the north of Israel. Thank you. Yeah, I was in 5 hospitals. I've spoken to Terry Glavin, who's a fantastic and courageous Canadian journalist who's been there, who's been in the north of Israel, been talking to people, and I believe he's been in the south of Syria too. And Israel, for really, reasons of its own, has been treating a lot of people, and a lot of people who are not friendly to Israel and who are not friendly politically to them. So I think that they have really developed a really good way of getting some aid to the nightmare that is the Syrian war. And I think it's a good thing. People should understand that when Israel does something good, people are really suspicious. And they say, actually they're just pretending to be good, but really they're bad. And if you say, no, they're really good, they're really treating lots of people and putting resources in, and they say, well, that just shows how clever they are, doesn't it? And you say, well, there really is lesbian and gay rights in Tel Aviv, and Tel Aviv really does have a free, culture where people can be who they want to be. And again, you have this word pinkwashing, which says the Israelis are so clever that they not only pretend to be nice, but they're actually nice in order to cover their real big crimes. So again, I think that's one thing about the kind of way in which that stuff was thought of. I don't know the details. I mean, I don't know what you can get away with if you go behind the back of the Foreign Office, and I'm not a government minister and I don't know how that works. But it seems to me that government ministers go on holiday, they have friends, they talk to people around the world, and probably a lot of the people they talk to are in other people's governments, and it seems to me that probably usually there's not an issue. But the discourse around secret meetings with Israel plays into an old kind of conspiracy theory discourse, and that is quite important. So I suspect that had something to do with how people thought of it. Then Jeremy Corbyn more than once has called for inquiries into how the British civil service and the British government is directed or influenced by the Zionist lobby, by the Israel lobby. And again, it keys into a whole notion of Jewish power and behind the scenes tentacles and all of this stuff. And it's a real problem in the way that he thinks. People might have remembered the Al Jazeera documentary that was written to kind of expose some of these links behind secret links in British politics. One of the things they did was to come and secretly talk to me. And some guy kind of pretended to be interested and pretended to be nice to me, and I bought him lunch, and he sat there, and then he had to go outside to have a cigarette. And it turned out later that they were taking people outside because they had a guy with a very long lens, and they were recording what people said, and they wanted me to say something stupid or something racist or something to show off about my links with Israel or whatever. Apparently I didn't do any of that because they didn't use the footage of me. But that idea that the Israelis are powerful and that that's how they get away with these terrible crimes is important, and it connects to older stories about Jews.
Hi, I'm Darren Cutler. For a long time, I've suggested years, I've increasingly paid less and less attention to mainstream media coverage for a whole variety of reasons, and therefore I get my information not only from the mainstream media, the little of it that I hear, listen to radio, other than mainstream and 10 o'clock news, but from alternative sources, internet and so forth. My question is this: from an academic and I guess from a practical perspective, how do you think modern day anti-Semitism that's clearly linked, some may say, to anti-Zionism, how can it be pushed back and fought against?
Well, I don't know how it can be pushed back and fought against. I guess by people giving talks in synagogues and writing books and making arguments and trying to get some understanding of what's really happening and trying to make art, to publicise those understandings. I think we have to be a little bit careful about the whole notion of kind of mainstream media, because that's become a way of kind of, in itself, of being fast and loose with facts. If anybody says anything in the media that we don't like, the option is there to kind of say, well, this is just fake news and we don't like it. I think we need to be careful when we talk about the BBC, for example, and The Guardian. I think the BBC and The Guardian don't have a sort of conspiracy to do down the Jews or the Israelis, but I think that they do reflect the milieu from which they recruit and from which they go to dinner parties with, and, they are amongst the good people, and the good people have taken on certain understandings of Israel and its place in the world and all of that stuff. So I think there is a problem with reporting, but I think, there is some terrific reporting about the Middle East, and there's some awful reporting about the Middle East. And what The Guardian does really is to host a debate between those who push an anti-Semitic worldview and those who oppose an anti-Semitic worldview. And that's the issue. And actually, when it comes to it, Johnny Friedland always writes the op-ed, and he always writes it quite well. So The Guardian itself, in the end, is always pretty good. But what it does is it hosts a debate. It allows people like Azam Tamimi, the defender of Hamas, and even, I think, Ahmadinejad himself, to become part of the debate, part of the discussion. And we don't do that with other things, right? If we, in a liberal anti-racist paper, we don't have a discussion about whether women's place should be in the home and in the kitchen, or whether women should be equal citizens. We assume that women should be equal citizens, and we kind of fight for that way of thinking. We don't host a debate about it. We don't host a debate about whether black people should have civil rights. We don't host a debate about whether black people have a lower IQ than white people. We leave that to the kind of racist fringes. But with contemporary anti-Semitism, it's no longer confined to the weirdo racist fringes, and that's the worry.
David Hyman, can you explain, as regarding Trump, what is his motivation for what he's trying to achieve in the Middle East? And is this a poisoned chalice that we're dealing with?
Goodness me. I don't know what Trump's motivation for anything is, and I don't know what he's trying to achieve in the Middle East. I'm worried about the kind of politics that Donald Trump represents and the kind of politics that he's brought into the mainstream. If you remember the final day campaign video, I believe it was written by Steve Bannon. It was a conspiracy theory video. It had scary music. It focused on George Soros and Yellen and a number of Jews. And it said, the people who run global finance are not on your side. They're putting you out of work. They're putting the car factories into rust. They're selling your jobs to China. And that whole politics of resentment, of tear it all down and start again, the politics of Muslims as terrorists and Mexicans as rapists, all of that bothers me. And actually, it seems to me that that is very much part of the kind of Corbynite problem rather than part of the solution. To come back to your specific question, I don't know. I mean, look, it can go a number of ways, can't it? I don't trust Donald Trump. It seems to me that if he does good things, it's probably by accident. But, I mean, it's noticeable right now, this minute, that Donald Trump is the guy tweeting support of the Iranian Democrats and the Iranian people who are fighting against the state and the Iranian women who are taking off their hijabs. And it's noticeable that neither Theresa May nor Jeremy Corbyn are doing that. And, people say, well, even a stopped clock is right twice a day. That could be true too. I don't have any faith in Trump. I think Trump's effect on bringing things into the mainstream political culture in America which shouldn't be there, racism and misogyny and and sexual abuse and all of the things he brags about are problematic. What he's trying to do in the Middle East, I don't know, and I'm very doubtful.
I'd now like to call on Rabbi Jeffrey Schisler to propose the vote of thanks.
Of all of us here, I'd like to thank you very much indeed. I'm sure you'll understand what I mean if I say that I suspect there's very little that you've said this evening that we didn't know, but it has been exceedingly interesting and very useful to have it all laid out in the way that you've done for us this evening. It's been very, very useful to us. I've noticed, it's very notable, you haven't made any distinction whatsoever between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. And that reminds me of Martin Luther King, when the story is that a student came to him and said, Dr. King, I'm not anti-Semitic at all. I'm just against the state of Israel. And Dr. King said, you're talking nonsense. You cannot be anti-Zionist without being an anti-Semite. And I think the way you've laid this information out this evening has actually confirmed that. It has for me. In conclusion, by way of consolation, I don't know if any of you do the YouGov polls. I do. And there was an exceedingly interesting one on people's knowledge of the Middle East. Did you see that by any chance? It's exceedingly, just about 2 weeks ago. I found it fascinating because it showed that 75% of people who responded to the poll either know nothing whatsoever or very little indeed about what goes on in the Middle East. My view has always been that, well, I can say it now, 75% of people out there don't care about Israel. They have no interest in Israel. They have as much interest in Israel as they have in Peru. It doesn't have any impact on their lives whatsoever. And I think we should take some kind of consolation from that. I'm sure that we have a gift for you. I don't know about you, but I could do with a drop of this after hearing all that. But I hope you will enjoy it. And thank you very, very much indeed for coming.